I know this might sound really weird, but I want to start this video by talking about the very first scene of the very first episode of both adaptations of Rurouni Kenshin. They both show us the same thing, which is Kenshin's role in the revolution which led to the Meiji era, but in completely different ways and with completely different tones from each other. The most notable difference between them is that the old anime treats this information with much more mystery. It's described to us through word of mouth, like it's a local legend, so the images we're given are clearly only meant to be a general representation of, and not specifically what this event looked like. And the presentation of these images are indicative of that, with the somewhat shadowy nature they're all given. However, the new anime, weirdly enough, makes the decision to put us directly in the moment and show us all the killing Kenshin did in the past in a way that's much more real and tangible. I want to point this out because the build-up to the Kyoto arc in the original anime begins with a dream flashback that meaningfully expands on the opening scene of the first episode. Actually getting to witness Kenshin's backstory being depicted in such a brutally honest way, in stark contrast to how it was presented in the opening narration, serves as an eye-opening experience for the audience, as it sheds light on how differently Kenshin views this event compared to the way the rest of the world, and by extension, we saw it based on how we were told the story. I thought this was a neat way of getting the audience to sympathize with Kenshin and feel for how underplayed his trauma was in the grand scheme of things, and the surprise that comes from the realization of how dark this portion of Kenshin's life was is effectively neutered in the new adaptation when this is literally the first thing we see in it. This wouldn't be nearly as frustrating though if the old version didn't do such a good job of actually portraying Kenshin's suffering here. There's a real sense of dread during the sequence, especially in the shots leading up to Kenshin's first on-screen kill. The repeated close-ups of Kenshin's face in between his approach are incredible at conveying how much he hates what he's doing and how he has to constantly steel himself to even go through with it, and the sickening look on his face after the deed is done all but confirms how painful of a memory this is for him. His trauma can also be felt just from how genuinely violent this sequence is in comparison to the rest of the show. We've seen characters bleed before, but here the camera is particularly interested in emphasizing huge blood splatters and stains being left on the surrounding area. It seems to be a big sticking point in his memory. None of this comes through as strongly, if at all, in the new version of the scene, as it's almost entirely focused on Kenshin's confrontation with this guy named Saito, which means it doesn't even attempt to visually suggest anything about Kenshin's emotions or how he personally viewed this portion of his life. And this isn't even close to the only example of this. Case in point, the very next scene of Kenshin confiding in Kaoru and Yahiko about his dream and how it tries to suggest that something is off about Kenshin here. This isn't at all reflected in the direction of the scene, or Kenshin's demeanor, or anything visually. In fact, the only reason I even know Kenshin is supposed to come off as different here is because Kaoru says he does when she notes how strange it is for him to talk so much about his past. But when a difference like that is just stated, it holds little to no meaning from an audience perspective, even more than usual in this show since its general approach to storytelling includes characters talking about every excruciating detail of their lives when it's relevant to the plot of the episode. What I'm trying to say is, it's far more likely to think the sole purpose of the scene is to deliver exposition about a group known as the Shinsengumi, as well as Kenshin's history with them, especially when it starts by flashing to a series of images which completely alienates the viewers from Kenshin's perspective, so it's unreasonable to assume anyone would be able to differentiate this shitty, pointless, and boring exposition scene from any of the other shitty, pointless, and boring exposition scenes. The only exception to this would be if the scene were to hint at that difference visually. To give you an example of what I mean by that, let's take a look at how the old version handles this scene. It's already made better by the way Kaoru condenses everything we need to know about the Shinsengumi into 2 lines and just lets Kenshin reflect on how he views the group, but there's also a subtle feeling of intensity to Kenshin's speech here, a feeling established by the added context of 2 prior scenes unique to this version of Kenshin silently losing his shit in response to his earlier dream. Both scenes juxtapose these picturesque moments of characters going about their daily routines and usual shenanigans against dark depictions of Kenshin's inner turmoil, and the darker elements of both scenes are transitioned to through objects becoming bloodstained as a way of representing Kenshin's immense guilt over these peaceful moments being built on a pile of corpses. On top of this being a much clearer way of showing that something is wrong with Kenshin, this also sets up important visual indicators by turning something as beautiful as a cherry blossom and scenic as a riverbank into grim reminders of all the lives he's stolen. So when you see these things being focused on in the cinematography of the following scene, you're able to register them as signs of Kenshin's insecurity and unease. Even his actual dialogue is made much more meaningful here, as unlike in the new version, the positive shit he says about the Shinsengumi is overlaid with images of him brutally cutting them down, which further cements how terrible it must have felt killing a bunch of people he actually respected. Because of all these additions, this scene honestly reads like a cry for help from Kenshin as he reflects on all the terrible stuff he had to do. So when Kaoru says it's strange for Kenshin to talk so much about his past, it makes a lot more sense because we can literally see the effect even remembering this stuff has on him. This scene is undeniably still feeding the audience exposition, but it places way more emphasis on its main character and his emotions, which actually allows you to engage in and sympathize with those emotions. It's impossible to do this with the new version of this scene because the show doesn't even make us aware of Kenshin's anxiety over his memories resurfacing until the very end of it. The 2 scenes that establish that in the original aren't in this one, which would be fine if this scene were able to convey that point by itself, but it just isn't, which is why it comes off as painfully dull and meaningless. The shots of nature don't mean anything now that they're not connected to those acid trips from the original. The glimpses of the Shinsengumi don't mean anything when they aren't dark or brutal enough compared to the rest of the show to convey Kenshin's severe trauma. And the things Kenshin says about how much he respected the Shinsengumi don't mean anything without a clear indication of how mentally taxing it was to kill a lot of their members. It also doesn't help how little weight Kenshin's facial expressions have here. There are like 2 shots of him looking more solemn, but for the majority of the scene he either wears a super default or slightly happy expression on his face. It almost comes off as if he's genuinely fond of these memories, like he misses his life and death clashes with the Shinsengumi, and if that was the overall point of this scene, then I wouldn't have a problem with it. But it's clearly meant to be ominous, as at the end of it, Kenshin becomes worried that his dream is a grim sign of things to come, and the fact that he was even talking about his past in the first place was supposed to be an indicator that something was wrong with him. So why the hell does he seem so casual about this? I could forgive this pretty easily if he at least reacted appropriately when Kaoru actually gave him reason to be concerned, but he only manages to make himself look slightly surprised by what she says. This line of dialogue was already an uninteresting way of conveying Kenshin's mental state, but his reaction to it doesn't even mark it as anything too significant. In the old anime, Kenshin reacts with a face that clearly gives off a sense of foreboding. Even the manga gets this right, so there's no excuse for such a lackluster expression here. It's not even just in this scene. There are several moments where the story calls attention to Kenshin's face, including a scene where Kaoru literally says he has a scary look on his face, and I just thought, what the hell are you talking about? At the most, he seems like he's just quietly reflecting on his current situation. What's supposed to be scary about this? At least in the old version, he clearly looked angry. Here, I honestly couldn't blame you if you thought he was just spacing out. Check out this next one. So when Kenshin eventually gets around to fighting Saito, there's this moment when he opens his eyes and the other characters go, oh shit, because they see this as him returning to being a manslayer. But how was this supposed to indicate that in the slightest? You see, what gets me the most about this scene is that the old anime already had a perfect way of indicating what the new one was trying to. They made his eyes gold whenever he transformed. It was clear and something that couldn't be confused with any other time he was just angry. For whatever reason, the new anime didn't give Kenshin a characteristic like this, so it's entirely reliant on his facial expression to convey the point, which it was pretty bad at doing, so the show instead relies on these characters just telling us what we needed to know again. These lacking expressions are a problem a lot of the characters are affected by in the new version, but it's especially bad in this episode because of how it tries and fails to use not just comedy, but comedy that's almost entirely reliant on how expressive the characters are in order to show you how unspirited Kenshin is by comparison. To see what a competent example of this looks like, the original version of the scene starts off feeling quiet and contemplative due to Kenshin's anxiety. The first 2 shots of the characters just walking along the road are perfect for establishing this atmosphere, as well as the more gradual pacing of the scene, which then bleeds into the beginning of the following tracking shot. And right after Kaoru finishes saying her line of dialogue, and just before you expect the show to cut again, we're interrupted by this. An unexpected punchline made perfect by the way Megumi announcing her arrival and her physically entering the frame are done in the same shot. It's so whimsical and immediately changes the tempo of the scene, as the second the story's focus leaves Kenshin, the characters jolt to life and become much more animated. On its own, the drastic yet seamless tone shift already conveys the point the scene needed to make by juxtaposing the other characters' energies against Kenshin's lack thereof. But as I alluded to earlier, it's the charming facial expressions of all the characters that make this so effective, as without them, the contrast between the funniness and tension of the scene wouldn't be felt as strongly when finally cutting back to Kenshin and showing him outright refusing to humor the situation. Ironically enough, this scene in the new version actually starts off with a pretty competently drawn and emphasized facial expression. This shot makes it pretty clear that Kenshin feels bummed out, and the cuts between him and his friends are also good at showing us how out of it he is right now. It serves as a decent setup for the other characters to later contrast against, but then Megumi comes in and the scene just falls apart. Right off the bat, the new show ruins the perfect joke from the old anime, which established Megumi's presence, as after she announces her arrival, the show cuts to an entirely different shot of her walking up to the other characters. The entire point of this tracking shot from the original was to surprise the audience with her sudden appearance in the background, and without that, there's no longer a clear jump in energy during this part of the scene anymore, which is a shame. Now, some of you are probably saying that the new anime isn't trying to be like the old version, and this is true, but it's definitely trying to be like the manga, and the panels representing this moment are more akin to the way the original anime adapted it. If the character interactions were strong enough to convey the point of the scene by themselves, then I wouldn't have a problem with this, but as usual, the new anime makes all of its characters look as boring and personalityless as humanly possible. The only character who even tries to be funny is Yahiko, but he's the exception when he should be the majority. As a result, the emotional disparity between Kenshin and the rest of the group isn't felt that strongly. Oh no, Kenshin is making a slightly more boring face than the rest of us, whatever could be wrong. When a scene isn't actually punctuated by any kind of energy, it's hard to make the parts that intentionally lack it stand out as such. It honestly feels like Kenshin is matching the other characters in terms of energy, when he should be as far away from doing that as possible. Like in the Kuragasa plotline, both versions of the scene try to use comedy in order to bolster its drama, but the new anime's unenthusiastic sense of humor leads to those dramatic elements falling completely flat, as well as much bigger issues with the overall story of these episodes. What I loved about the comedy in the old version is how effectively it served as a baseline of happiness which Kenshin was taken away from and constantly being distracted from going back to. While other characters are going through their usual dynamics as if nothing is wrong, you'll often see Kenshin struggle to or not even attempt to participate in any of their shenanigans. And even when Kenshin is completely isolated from the other characters, the show makes an effort to keep their humor present in order to reinforce in your mind what he's missing out on. Whether you consciously recognize it or not, these moments are priming you to hope for Kenshin to return to the cheerfulness he's been trying to avoid. And what's messed up about these scenes is that they'll usually be followed up by an ominous reminder of why he can't do that. Seeing him push himself this far away from the levity and calm he's found so much comfort in gives you something to root for. Now, this is a very clever setup and also an important reason as to why this part of the story is so emotional in the old version, but it would mean almost nothing if the show didn't do its damnedest to make its comedy so memorable and endearing. Because to be perfectly honest, there's no reason to feel bad over the thought of a character potentially losing something if that thing isn't even something you'd miss. You might be able to understand the character is disappointed, but you probably can't feel that disappointment for yourself, and you definitely can't sympathize with it. This is exactly why it's such a big deal that the new anime continuously refuses to consider how its comedy impacts the story. It very clearly tries to take advantage of the same setup from the old anime, but fails completely because it's just not funny. Look at how many comedic scenes from the old anime are either entirely absent from or severely watered down in the new version. Even the manga goes out of its way to include these expressive faces as well as more lighthearted moments during this part of the story because it understands that the audience can't get attached to nothing. The moment all the tension from the storyline is supposed to spike is in Kenshin's fight with Saito, where he finally breaks and completely forgets about all the things he holds dear to himself. But while watching this in the new version, all I could do was ask why. Why does Kaoru think Kenshin is going to disappear after this fight? Why would I even care if Kenshin were to do that? Why should I feel scared about the idea of Kenshin reverting into a manslayer if I'm not even attached to his normal personality? And why in the ever-loving hell should I feel relieved that Kenshin is engaging in the comedy of the show again by doing his swirly eyes thing when the comedy of the show wasn't charming in the first place? The only answer I could come up with for any of these questions is because the show is telling me to feel that way. It doesn't put in the effort to portray Kenshin's anxiety like the old version does, and it doesn't put in the effort to make its characters' interactions fun or engaging, again like the old version does. It just tells you how you're supposed to feel, and that sucks. The fight itself isn't even memorable as an action scene, since it looks and feels identical to all of the rest of Kenshin's encounters with his boring-ass opponents. This is not at all the case for the original adaptation, which couldn't have looked more different from the rest of the show here with this suffocating darkness engulfing everything. Almost everything about this fight blows in the new version, and the only reason left for me to be even slightly invested in it is if I felt it built up Saito well as a villain, which I don't. While he manages to be threatening in a physical sense since he immediately does more damage to Kenshin than any of his other opponents up until this point, I feel like he falls short from a psychological standpoint. One of the best things about Saito in the old version is how genuinely creepy he managed to be. This made him a credible threat, not only to Kenshin's life, but also his mental stability as a person. What really got you feeling his presence, though, was the insanely memorable way he was framed in every one of his scenes. The most notable example of what I'm talking about is the way he comes into contact with Kaoru at her dojo. This scene starts off with Kaoru and Yahiko speculating about what Kenshin is so occupied with, which is already a much cuter joke here than it is in the new version, but I digress. What I like about this setup is that it lowers your guard before transitioning into a much more sinister tone through some expert sound design. There's something so eerie about hearing the door to the dojo creak open and how the show lingers on the shot of the two characters for a while before drawing attention to it. Doubly so when you find out it was freaking Saito who just stood there for a bit watching them. By letting us hear the door open in the same shot where Kaoru is having this cute little freak out, it feels like Saito is cutting the moment short before the point it would have ended if left alone, as he forces himself into an intimate scene that only the viewers and main characters should be present for. This feeling is lost in the new version, as like with Megami's joke from before, the show cuts to a completely separate shot establishing Saito's presence. Because of this, the interaction between Kaoru and Yahiko feels more complete, and Saito's intrusion doesn't come off as that big of a deal since the direction of the scene goes out of its way to accommodate him. The original anime made a point of emphasizing the layer of uncomfortability that Saito's presence adds here. For one, it focuses on Kaoru's worried expression much more, and unlike in the new version, this face never changes to one of relief, which makes the atmosphere more oppressive. The following shot does the same thing, with the slight distortion and curvature in response to Saito's massive frame overlooking the other characters, but I especially like this shot of Saito's feet passing through the gate because of how long it takes to go over the line. It really drives home just how abnormal it is for him to be welcomed in, and is later contrasted against with a shot of Kaoru's and Kenshin's feet passing through the gate but in a much more comfortable way. In comparison, there's not much in the new version cinematography that expresses resistance to Saito casually entering Kenshin's literal living space. There are a couple of shaky shots of the characters' faces, but A, that's just kind of tacky, and B, this completely vanishes as soon as Saito says he's one of the chief's men. Saito just comes off as way more predatory and invasive in the old version, because all of his scenes feel so much more apprehensive even when he's doing something as simple as just walking along a road. It's because of this that he leaves a much bigger impact on the audience here. On top of his impact on the audience, the way he impacts Kenshin is also much more interesting in this version. Whereas the new version is content with just letting Kenshin recognize Saito as a threat, the old one makes Kenshin respond to him with much more paranoia. For instance, the scene in the dojo where Kenshin puts together that Saito is the one who attacks Inosuke. When he goes into detail about his signature sword style here, the show flashes to parts of the opening dream sequence, which in this version is much more strongly tied to Kenshin's immense trauma. So when he talks about Saito as these images are playing through his head, it's pretty easy to grasp that he's freaking the hell out at the thought of another confrontation with the guy. Hammering this home is the way his inner monologue is perfectly capped off by the giant lightning strike that brought their earlier fight to its haunting conclusion. In comparison, the new version uses more general images of Saito, while also flashing back to Sanosuke's fight with him. And although this does a good job of showcasing Saito's sword style, I wouldn't say this does anything to contextualize Kenshin's feelings on Saito himself, as these images aren't even from Kenshin's perspective, but rather that of an objective third person. Now let's take a look at the very next action Kenshin takes, which is striking the wall with his sword. In the original anime, Kenshin's walk towards the wall was heavily emphasized in a way similar to his walk in the opening sequence, with shots that focused on him steadily unsheathing his sword as he instinctively breaks out into a run. Like in the opening sequence, this is meant to convey Kenshin's hesitation as well as him steeling himself for what's to come, and instead of just striking at an empty space, we actually see him imagining Saito charging at him from outside. You can see how everything Kenshin does here is coded in concern over the prospect of crossing swords with this guy again. In the new version, however, this moment is incredibly brisk, and a lot of Kenshin's fear is extremely toned down, which is terrible because his fear of Saito is a big reason his mental degradation is supposed to be effective. It's not the only reason though, considering there are a couple of visual motifs in the old anime meant to signify this. There are a couple I haven't mentioned yet, but the one I want to call the most attention to is the variety of light sources that are continuously focused on just to disappear eventually. It's clear the show is using light fading as a way of indicating how close Kenshin is to completely reverting to his manslayer persona. For example, when Kenshin wonders to himself if he can beat Saito while upholding his no-kill rule, the candle in the room goes out. Then there's the fact that the fight against Saito, which is the point Kenshin finally snaps, literally starts with the sun setting behind some clouds. If that's not enough for you, look at how well lit the dojo becomes in response to Kenshin regaining his sense of self after this fight. Once this motif is fully established, the final episode of the storyline then takes the complete opposite approach from all the previous ones by shoving as much light in your face as possible. The sky becomes blinding, as do the windows it peers through and the water which reflects it. When Kenshin is walking through this hallway, our view is fixed on all the ceiling lights, and when he's overlooking some scenery on a bridge, a sunset and its glare on the camera are once again greatly emphasized to us. All of this is to remind us of what Kenshin has gained since settling down with Kaoru, and what he'll be losing by choosing to go to Kyoto. But the most impactful light source of them all is set up by the opening scene of this episode, where Kaoru's entire family asks Kenshin to go see fireflies with them by the riverbank. In the final scene, those fireflies are the only things lighting Kenshin's goodbye to Kaoru, and while plentiful, they're also small and faint in comparison to the darkness surrounding them, and in contrast to all of the previous light sources. It really speaks to the diminishing doubts in his mind at this moment, but what I love most about this scene is the way all of the fireflies gather around the two of them and shine so brightly as to overtake the darkness as Kenshin embraces Kaoru for the final time. There's nothing that could have given weight to how much Kaoru means to him more than making her the center of the light he finally brings himself to abandon at the end. It's fucking heartbreaking. Just like with almost everything I've talked about in this video so far, the new anime tries to make use of the same technique the original does, but fails to understand why that technique was so effective in the first place. Without the prior shots which gave this motif its meaning, the intense bloom in this scene feels so much more shallow, like this lighting effect was just tacked onto the scene in order to give it this heavenly feel, and not because it represents something far more substantial. And as a result, the final scene where Kenshin leaves just doesn't have that much impact. This is probably just because I'm an asshole, but I actually kind of chuckled when a random dark void just suddenly appeared around Kenshin as he was walking away here. That shit isn't as poignant when you don't naturally incorporate it into your scene. Now, I've ragged on the visuals of this show a lot in this video, and while it was definitely relevant to why I didn't like these episodes in the new version, it's also something I've already talked about multiple times in my other videos. So why was I so focused on going into excruciating detail about all the intricacies of the old anime's filmmaking while simultaneously pointing out how it blew the new one out of the water? Well, because unlike the rest of the show, this is a really monumental part of the story, one that leads to Kenshin leaving the comfortable life he's found with Kaoru and disregarding the formula that the entire narrative was based on up until this point. So I guess I was just even more taken aback than usual by the new anime's incredibly flat direction, which does almost nothing to convey this plotline as anything more significant than your average episode. That's all I had to say, so I'll be going now.